So we are nearing the end of summer and nearing the end of this series, 1st and 2nd Samuel. I think including this week, we've got 3 more weeks left. How many of you have enjoyed going through the narratives of 1st and 2nd Samuel? Raise your hand if you feel like it's been edifying to you. How many of you feel like you've been learning something? Okay. Thank you, Jesus. That's what we hoped for, right? I've made the case many times, and I distinctly remember Bill making the case many times, that these are some of the most compelling stories ever told. Really fascinating characters, really not just the main characters, you know, your Absaloms and your Davids and your Sauls and Samuel, but also kind of the minor characters are really interesting. How many of you have picked up on the importance of Joab so far? Significant character, really propels the narrative forward after David kind of, what's the right way of putting this, loses his vigor a little bit. It's Joab who's kind of acting like a proxy king for much of the latter half of 2 Samuel, and he's kind of calling the shots even after he's removed from his office as general of the armies. And we'll talk about that hopefully a little bit today. But we've got quite a bit to cover. I'm going to start, I think, in 14, and I'm hoping to end at 20. So we'll hopefully be moving at a blistering pace, and let me know if you've got any questions. Right now, open up to 2 Samuel chapter 14. The tail end of it, just some things to note. Starting at verse 25, so 14:25. So we've had the tragedy of Bathsheba and Uriah. We've had the horrific tragedy of Tamar. We've had Absalom kill Amnon, his brother. We've had Absalom flee, and then Absalom brought back by whose work? Joab. Yeah, it's Joab that sticks his nose in David's business with good reason. And then we get this period of time where David and Absalom are not on speaking terms, right? And all the while this is embittering Absalom towards David. And as Pastor Tucker talked about last weekend, Absalom is a clever kid. He starts kind of plotting and scheming and politicking and campaigning to win over the hearts of Israel. And when he's brought back in chapter 14, verse 25, it talks about his appearance. Now, we've seen with at least 2 other individuals in this narrative, both David and Saul, that the kings of Israel tend to be good-looking guys. Now, part of me thinks, well, it's written, by people who supported those kings. So is this just like, if my wife was writing the narrative of my life, would she describe me as handsome? I wonder how handsome these guys really were. But it says of Absalom, now in all Israel, there was no one so much to be praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the sole of his feet to the crown of his head, there's some loaded language. So you should, anytime you get kind of these graphic descriptions of a person's appearance, just make a note of it because it's probably going to play into the story later on. To the crown of his head, so you've got the image of a crown, you've got the mention of his head, there was no blemish in him. And when he cut the hair of his head, so go ahead and make note of his hair, for at the end of the year he used to cut it. When it was heavy on him, he cut it. He weighed the hair of his head 200 shekels by the king's weight. There were born to Absalom 3 sons and 1 daughter whose name was Tamar. She was a beautiful woman. So Absalom lives in Jerusalem. And then we get to chapter 15. And just some small details I want to point out, which I thought was interesting. I read through 1st and 2nd Samuel again this week, just seeing if there was anything thematic that I thought recurred in these chapters. It says, after this, Absalom got himself a chariot. Now, that's interesting. How many kings of Israel have we seen with chariots so far? None. But by my reading, none. Neither David nor Saul. When was the last time we saw chariots mentioned in this narrative? It's mentioned by Samuel in 1 Samuel when Samuel is doing what before Israel? He's warning them about their future kings. Anybody remember that? It's really, really important. Let's go have a little look at it. These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots. Now, the warning, does this seem like the kind of king Israel is going to want as you read through this warning from Samuel? No. So we're going to see after Solomon, there are a number of really, really bad kings in Israel's history and Judah's history. And I would say Absalom is kind of the first of the really, really bad kings. But that's while David is still living. But where else have we seen chariots mentioned in Scripture? Who had chariots? Egyptians, specifically which Egyptian? Pharaoh. Pharaoh. Keep that character in your mind as we read the narrative of Absalom and David's fleeing from Absalom. That should be playing into your conceptions. Who else? We've had the northern Canaanites are mentioned as having chariots. Are they smiled upon in the biblical narrative? No, they're enemies of God's people. What about the Arameans? That's the only other mention I could remember. Are they thought of fondly? No. So are chariots associated with good things in biblical literature to this point? No, they are not. So I'm not going to do too much on 15, at least this section, where Absalom is garnering support and loyalty over the course of 4 years as he is playing this judicial role, or at least claiming to want to play this judicial role for all the tribes of Israel. And he's, like I said, he's campaigning. And this is, it's not just something he's doing, but it's probably getting after a problem that existed within Israel even before Absalom started trying to win the hearts of the people, which seems to be what? What's the problem that exists? You've got a unified kingdom of Israel and Judah, but does David seem to favor one above the other? Who's David's flesh and blood? Judah. Yeah. The kings before David, the king before David. Which part of Israel did he come from? Benjamin, right? The tribe of Benjamin, a northern, right? So there seems to be this, and you'll see it as the text goes on, describing the two armies of Absalom and David. It seems like there is a problem already that exists between the perception of Israel in regards to their relationship to David the king and David's relationship to Judah. There seems to be a favoritism that is causing some toxic feelings between these two segmented groups of all the tribes of Israel. And Absalom is going to play to that, to win over the hearts of the people. So Absalom then asks David if he can go to Hebron. What's significant about that? It's where Absalom was born. What else? Who else was anointed in Hebron? David, his father. Yeah, so Absalom is going to, and Pastor Tucker talked about this, he's going to kind of replay the steps of David and reclaim all that was David's for himself. And we're going to get that kind of pinnacle moment with the concubines, the wives of David later on. So fast forward a little bit, go down to verse 18, just some things I want to point out in the text. So what we'll see with David, Absalom garners the support. He claims himself to be king, and then he's going to go to Jerusalem, and David is going to flee. Now, there seems to be this recurring thing in biblical literature when when Israel, or I'm using Israel as an all-encompassing term here, but when God's people are removed, sent into exile, there seems to be a movement east, okay? David moves east from the land to go across the Jordan, and he's representative of all Israel in this moment. So typologically speaking, we're going to see this again when? An exile east. Babylon. Who said Babylon? Yeah, Babylon. We're going to see Nebuchadnezzar and his armies are going to take King Jehoiakim, sorry, all those J names, King Jehoiakim and the exiles of Judah east away from Jerusalem, which is associated with the presence of Yahweh, right? Going all the way back to the Torah, Yahweh has said that he's going to place his presence in Jerusalem. So what's the first instance you can think of the people of God moving in exile east from the presence of God? Sorry, I think I heard it in the back again. Eden, yeah, Eden, that's exactly right. East from the garden, away from the presence of God. And I'm not the first person to think of this, but I always think of the Eden narrative as being like temple literature, right? It's talking about this place where God resides amongst his people, and they're exiled from the garden away from the presence of God. So David is going to play act basically this movement east, which happens to God's people at a number of times in their history, and it's going to reach its fulfillment in which character? Who is removed from the presence of God in exile? An Eastern movement out of the city. Sunday school answer. Come on, everyone. Jesus. Jesus, the King, the anointed one to reside in God's presence, is rejected by his city, much like David, right? He's going to move out of the city where he will be killed. He will experience an exile, a separation from God that he will cry out about. Remember? Connecting the narrative together now. You see typologically, David represents Israel. Jesus represents David, who represents all of Israel, right? He is the fulfillment of all of these things. And that's what you're meant to see as you read through the Jesus story. You'll also notice I mentioned Absalom compares well with what character did I say from Exodus? Pharaoh, yeah. Pharaoh. You have in 15 verses 18 through 23, the verb as David is fleeing Jerusalem for Passover is used a number of times. It's the same word for Passover in the Exodus narrative. He's got, what's interesting about this is David is going to kind of reenact the early events of his life. He's going to be removed from the city by a king who is pursuing to kill him. So kind of connecting us to the story of Saul. He's going to find companionship and hospitality in the presence of what kind of people? Foreigners. Yeah, we've seen this before with David, right? So he's going to be chased out, and go to verse 21, something that I found really interesting on like my fifth or sixth read through of this passage. We've got this character, Ittai, who demonstrates a unique faithfulness to David. This foreigner pledging his faithfulness to David. And what story does that kind of connect you to? Go ahead. Yeah. Ruth and Naomi. Yeah, very similar language. As Yahweh lives and as my Lord the King lives, wherever my Lord the King shall be, whether for death or for life, there also will your servant be. So again, another monumental vow of faithfulness given by a foreigner to the one who would carry on the line that extends to the Messiah. We saw it first with Naomi, and now we see it in the life of David, who is the descendant of Boaz, who is the relative of Naomi, right? So really kind of interesting things happening in the narrative here. David says, go then, pass on, or pass over, literally in Hebrew. So Ittai the Gittite passed on with all his men and the little ones who were with him, and all the land wept aloud as all the people passed by or passed over. And the king crossed the brook Kidron, and all the people passed on towards the wilderness. So I'm calling this not only is it typological of the exile that Israel has faced or the people of God have faced before, but it's kind of like another exodus is happening. David is escaping this Pharaoh figure, this unrighteous king who is trying to annihilate and persecute the people of God, and there's going to be a Passover that takes place as he is going away from the presence of God into a wilderness area. You get a really, really, really important interaction, and please make note of this. Verse 24, it says, and Abiathar came up, and behold, Zadok came also with all the Levites bearing the ark of the covenant of God. Have we had trouble with the ark of the covenant of God before? Yes, we have. In 1 Samuel, remember who abused the presence of the ark? Before Saul, Eli's sons, remember? They took the ark, brought it into battle, very stupidly, and what happened to them? They died for it. So they come with the ark and the covenant of God, they set it down, and the people pass over out of the city, and the king says to Zadok, carry the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the eyes of Yahweh, he will bring me back and let me see both it and his dwelling place. So what will David not do here? He will not try to tokenize or instrumentalize the Ark of the Covenant of God. He will kind of rectify the mistakes of Eli and his sons by honoring the Ark and sending it back to this place where God, all the way back in the Torah, said that his presence would reside. And so David demonstrates a unique faithfulness. And it's these kinds of interactions for David that define really what it means when it says that David is a man after Yahweh's own heart. The fact that even that he accepts, number one, he's being driven out of the city of God, but that the presence of God should remain where it's meant to be. He will not use it for his own advantage. He will trust God to vindicate him one way or the other. Note, as David leaves in verse 30, he went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. Later on, who will we see weeping over the city from the Mount of Olives? Jesus, right? As he is also rejected by the city, and he cries out, Jerusalem, if only you knew what God was offering to you, if you knew the king who comes to you. How is he described? Barefoot and with his head covered. So we've had in 2 chapters now, 2 men whose heads are described in detail. A little interesting, right? One is Absalom, and he's got a beautiful head of hair, just the most striking head you've ever seen. And David, whose head is covered in shame and grieving as he leaves the city that is ultimately rejecting him. And all the people who were with him covered their heads. And they went up weeping as they went, and it was told David, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Yahweh, please turn his counsel into foolishness. And does Yahweh answer the prayer? Immediately. Immediately within the text. While David was coming to the summit where Yahweh was worshipped, behold, Hushai, the Archite, came to meet him with his coat torn and dirt on his head. What is that? What do those details represent of Hushai? Mourning, faithfulness to David. This is going to be, the reason I'm pointing out all these little details is we're going to have in just a second here an interaction between a servant of the house of Saul, a servant of Mephibosheth, and he's going to make some claims about his master. Later on, we're going to see that same man appear before David, and there's going to be details about his appearance that I want you to note, because I think it undermines some of what Ziba says about his master, okay? So just note all the times that someone's appearance is explicitly mentioned and what those things are meant to signify. So he comes to the place where God is worshipped. Hushai appears before him. And David says, if you go on with me, you'll be a burden. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I will be your servant, O king, as I have been your father's servant in time past, so now I will be your servant. Then you will defeat for me the counsel of Ahithophel. So David, we're finally seeing David act like David again, right? A little bit of that clever old dog in him, right? He does his best work when he's fleeing for his life, right? That's when he's at his most clever. It's when he is sitting in the comfort of his own power, that's when he sins, right? So we see David kind of reverting back to his old self as he's kind of reliving these events of his life, of his fleeing from Saul. He's going to specifically have interactions with Saul's family and servants, which is important in the narrative to kind of bring us back to that time in David's life. And the first one of those people is going to be Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth. And he comes with donkeys and hundreds of loaves of bread, 100 bunches of raisins, 100 of summer fruits, and a skin of wine. And David says to him, why have you brought these? And Ziba answered, the donkeys are for the king's household to ride on, the bread and summer fruit for the young men to eat, and the wine for those who faint in the wilderness to drink. And David said, where is your master's son? Ziba said, behold, he remains in Jerusalem. And this is the part that I want you to underline. For he said, today the house of Israel will give me back the kingdom of my father. Have we had any interactions with Mephibosheth in this narrative before? We have in the early part of 2 Samuel. Is there any reason to think that he feels this way? No. Has David treated Mephibosheth well? Yeah, he not only didn't kill him, which he would have had a right to do, Mephibosheth is a man who, for all of his life, has had some level of disability. So it's kind of naive to think that he was going to wrest power away from Absalom, but he was also granted the privilege, not just of the estate of his father, to keep that, but also he was given a place at David's table. So you should be reading that, I guess, based on the interactions earlier in the narrative, and you should be a little bit suspicious of what Ziba is saying concerning Mephibosheth. And I think, if you trust me, that's going to pay off in a couple of chapters when we get back to Mephibosheth, okay? So just highlight or underline that and put a little question mark by it and say, is this guy lying? Is this guy taking advantage of a circumstance for his own prosperity? Then we get to Shimei, who curses David. Again, the interactions and dynamics of the house of Saul. Ziba and Mephibosheth, they specifically, Mephibosheth, these names, I tell you what, is the son of which of Saul's children? Jonathan. Yeah, and who helped David the first time he fled from an unrighteous king? Jonathan. So that's important to highlight there. And now you've got a man from the house of the tribe of Benjamin who will come out and persecute David, and he will throw stones at him in a mocking of passing a judgment on him that David should die for his capital crimes. And as David is fleeing Jerusalem, as he's being exiled from Jerusalem, being mocked, insults hurled at him, again, typologically, which character are you seeing here? Jesus, right? Does David take vengeance upon any of these men, Mephibosheth or Shimei, later on in the narrative? No, so we see David typifying a kind of Christ. And we'll see Christ himself will wait on the Lord's vindication of him. He will not take vengeance upon his enemies. He will wait for the Lord's vindication. David's response is certainly interesting. He says, "Behold, my own son," this is verse 11, "seeks my life. How much more may this Benjamite? Leave him alone and let him curse, for Yahweh has told him to. It may be that Yahweh will look on the wrong done to me, and that Yahweh will repay me with good for his cursing today." So what is David holding on to in this moment? Yahweh's faithfulness, right? And why? Because he's received a promise in chapter 7 of 2 Samuel. So the king, verse 14, "and the people arrive weary at the Jordan." Is the Jordan significant in the movement of God's people from wilderness into promised land? Yeah, of course. And now they're going to cross back over the Jordan. So, Absalom enters Jerusalem, and Hushai the Archite appears to him with a little double entendre. Long live the king, long live the king. Who's he talking about? David, I think. And he kind of worms his way into favor with Absalom. He puts on a convincing show. And then we get this counsel from Ahithophel. Just a few notes to point out, because Pastor Tucker did talk about this. What is Ahithophel's counsel? First. Sleep with David's concubines. If you guys aren't comfortable being that direct, I'll be that direct. Sleep with David's concubines. It's public in the sense that it happens on a roof. There's a fun detail to note. What else happened on a roof? David lusted after Bathsheba. Is that deliberate by the author to mention the location? You betcha. You better highlight it, underline it, cross-reference it, make sure you're making note of all this stuff. This is really well-constructed narrative. Yeah, it's packed with meaning. And there was a fourfold recompense that was promised to David, right? We talked about that last Sunday. What were they? What was the recompense? The child's going to die. Sword against David's house. Evil within his own house. We've seen that play out a number of times already. And then what's the last one? I will send your neighbor to take your wives in the sight of all Israel, in the sight of the sun. Remember that? So this is the fourfold repayment to Uriah and Bathsheba that is coming to fruition here in the place where it all began, on the roof. The tent is important. It wasn't like a public act of Absalom sleep. It was public in the sense everyone knew what was happening when he went into the tent, but it's not like they could see what was happening. I just want to make that clear from the text. We've got the note about the counsel of Ahithophel. And then we have, again, the answered prayer of Hushai, kind of confounding the wisdom of Ahithophel and duping Absalom into joining or into receiving his counsel. And I love the note that Pastor Tucker mentioned in verse 14 of chapter 17. For Yahweh had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that Yahweh might bring harm upon Absalom. Yahweh uses the folly of Hushai to confound the wisdom of the wise, Ahithophel. Have we seen other Bible verses talk about Yahweh's use of folly to confound the wise? Yeah, Paul writes in this exact same way, that the cross and Christ on a cross is folly, right? It defies the wisdom of the world, but that's how God chooses to act. And so we see it play out here in the narrative. So then I'm trying to go as quick as I can. Hushai will say to Zadok and Abiathar, at some point we're going to have a change in the high priesthood, right? At some point Zadok is going to become the high priest in place of Abiathar because of what event earlier in 1 Samuel? the curse against Eli's house. So note that Zadok and Abiathar are being mentioned side by side here. At some point, it's going to shift from Abiathar and the line of Eli as the high priest over Israel to Zadok. And that's going to be, I think, I'm trying to remember for sure, I think it's Solomon who explicitly appoints Zadok as the high priest. So they relay the message, Hushai to the priests to their sons. And then you've got a funny little story here of Jonathan and Ahimaaz are waiting at Enrogel, and a female servant goes to them and tells them what's happening. And then a young man rats them out, and then what are they forced to do? Hide in a well. A woman hides them in a well. What story from earlier in our biblical narrative does that make you think of? Yeah, Rahab, who hides the spies that were sent into Jericho, and who comes seeking after those spies? The king of Jericho, right? So we're having typified for us a bunch of different kinds of unrighteous kings that Absalom is coming to represent. Not just Pharaoh, but the king of Jericho. We're going to see later on there's going to be some connections to Saul as well. So he is this, one commentator I read posed him as this satanic, uncovenant king. And it's important in the narrative that when Absalom makes himself king, what is missing from his coronation that was there with David and Saul previously? There's no anointing and no rushing of what thing? The Spirit. And so if you had never read this text before, these would be clues as you're reading as to who is truly the righteous king that has the anointing, because it's missing from Absalom's story, and the author is showing us little examples of how Absalom is replaying all the mistakes of these wicked kings before him. Okay? So, just note in verse 22, it says, David arose and all the people who were with him, what do? They cross the Jordan. And then Ahithophel hangs himself. Seems a little bit like an overreaction, probably on first read. But why do you think he did this? What's that, Brian? Well, he still would have had a place counseling the king, I think. I would guess this is a calculus by a wise man, Ahithophel, that Absalom did not strike David when he should have. Could Absalom have destroyed David and his armies when they first fled? Yeah, they're weary. David's barefoot. They're grieving. They don't have a lot of military support with them yet. We only have the mention of these foreigners that are accompanying David. That was exactly the right time to strike. And now I think Ahithophel has done the math that David has garnered enough support for him over the years that he's going to be able to leverage the situation and win back his throne. And if David wins back his throne, what's going to happen to Ahithophel? He's dead either way. And so he kills himself in the story. I liked on my reading this idea of David being shown hospitality by foreigners. It makes me think of passages in the law which specifically require what of Israelites in regards to foreigners in the land? Show hospitality to them. So kind of this inversion of the law, as before when Israel was going through the wilderness, or when they spent time in Egypt and the Egyptians initially showed them hospitality. Now the law is bearing its fruit in this appointed one of Israel, David, receiving hospitality from these pagan nations. So kind of this fun echo of the law as I was reading through it. Okay, 18. We'll spend a good chunk in here. So a lot of things building up to this point. As you can probably tell at this point, this document that I put in front of you is just for you. I am not using this today. I've got all my stuff in my handy-dandy Bible that I want to talk about. This is for when you go back, hopefully, and read it again for yourselves, you have this as a supplemental thing, okay? So if you're looking at this and you're like, what the heck is this guy talking about? It's not anywhere. You're right, it's not. The margins are for you to make additional notes. Yes, ma'am. Ahithophel? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. I could see what you mean. Yeah, I would say that the motive of his hanging is not guilt. I think it's a kind of a cold calculus. I don't think there's nothing, at least textually to me, to support the conclusion that he regrets siding with Absalom, apart from Absalom not taking his counsel. Now, we can question the motive as to why the grandfather of Bathsheba would go against David. That seems pretty clear. But again, that's also not in the text. So I really try to not supply anything more than what the text lays out for us. Okay, 18. So David has mustered up men to fight with him. And I'll just read through some of 18, and we can talk about what sticks out that I would hope that you would see as we've been going through this narrative. David mustered the men who were with him and sent them over, the commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. And David sent out the army, and 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the men, I myself will also go out with you. Why is this so interesting? Think back. Think back to the counsel of Hushai to Absalom. See, Hushai doesn't just delay Absalom, and that's why the wisdom is so, or that's why the counsel is so powerful. I want to read again what he actually says. He says, this is from, going back to 17, start at verse 8. You know that your father and his men are mighty men, and they are enraged like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. So he's playing to fear, right, around this mythological figure, David and his mighty men. Besides, your father is an expert in war. He will not spend the night with the people. Behold, even now he has hidden himself in one of the pits. Underline that, in one of the pits. Or in some other place, and as soon as some of the people fall at the first attack, whoever hears it will say, there has been a slaughter among the people who follow Absalom. Then even the valiant man, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will utterly melt with fear. For all Israel knows that your father is a mighty man, and those who are with him are valiant men. So there's a mention of the hearts of Absalom's men melting with fear and them fleeing. Go ahead and underline that. But my counsel is that all Israel be gathered to you. That's exactly what Absalom's going to do. From Dan to Beersheba, as the sand by the sea for multitude, and that you go to battle, how? In person. You, Absalom, need to go into battle as well. Really important, because what is David's counsel going to say to him? Don't go into battle. Their whole point is, if you die, the men lose all of their cause. And your son Absalom is really only after one man. Do you think either David or Absalom wanted a bunch of Israelite and Judean men to die? No, this is a battle fought for two men, between two loyalties. Absalom, in his pride and his arrogance and his desire to be seen as a great king and take the house of his father David, has fallen for the advice of Hushai that he needs to be one of the ones going into battle when he's got everything to lose, right? David, the seasoned warrior, the king with good counsel, hears from his men, dude, you'd be an idiot to go to battle. Stay back. We've got lots of men who can keep you safe. You're the whole reason we're fighting this battle right now. You see how God used the counsel of Hushai, not just to delay Absalom's attack, but to contort and twist his mind to inflate his ego so that he would go into battle. You see what's in the text there? That's why you've got these two mentions of Hushai saying, you need to go to battle, and David's counsel contrasting them saying, you shouldn't go to battle. That's why that's in there. The men said, you shall not go out, for if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us died, they won't care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore, it is better that you send us help from the city. And the king, so a little foreshadowing into who's going to win this battle, the king said to them, whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood at the side of the gate while all the army marched out hundreds and by thousands. And the king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. This is a sad story. As a father, this is a really sad story. And all the people heard, this is an important note, all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom. So the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim, and the men of Israel were defeated by the servants of David. And the loss there was great on that day, 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and this was so fascinating the first time I read it, and this is years ago now. And the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. What exactly does that mean? Anyone? Interesting. I hadn't considered that before. The word in Hebrew is literally to eat. So it's not just, it's saying the forest ate more men than the battle did. I have no idea what it means. I have no clue. And I think that's so interesting. But who do we see immediately after it makes this statement? Who's going to be devoured by the forest? Absalom. Yeah, that's going to be our key example here. And Absalom, this unrighteous king, happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on a mule. Interesting that he doesn't have his chariot. But he's on a mule, which is symbolic of what typically? Royalty, let's say. And the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head, have we seen his head mentioned before? Oh, it's a spectacular head, right? Hair so thick you could hang a man from it, right? His head got caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth. And what does the mule do? This symbolic mark of his royalty, the mule, leaves from under him. You get the symbolism, right? Really interesting stuff. And a certain man saw it and told Joab, behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. Joab said to the man who told him, what? You saw him? Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. But the man said to Joab, do you think I'm an idiot? No, he didn't say that, but in so many words. Even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son, for in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake, protect the young man Absalom. On the other hand, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there is nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof. Joab said, I will not waste time like this with you. And he took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. And 10 young men, Joab's armor bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. So why does Joab bring his armor bearers into the mix? Spread some responsibility around. Yeah, we all killed him. Everybody was doing it, right? It's interesting to me that Joab, this man who was complicit in the sin of David to begin with, who sent Uriah to the front lines, is now the one who is bringing about the punishment of David in the form of his son's death. It's interesting and poetic to me that Yahweh would use Joab to do this final thing to Absalom, kind of this repayment for Uriah. Just really interesting to me. It's also interesting that Joab was the one who brought Absalom back in the first place, right? And now here he is ending his life. Text has a few interesting details. It says they took Absalom and they threw him into a pit, which is where they warned that his father would be waiting for him, and raised over him a very great heap of stones. What do you think that's about? Okay, interesting. Yeah, so kind of like a poetic reversal, you think? Yeah, one commentator said that this is symbolic of his capital crime. They are stoning him by heaping great stones upon his dead body. I don't know about that. It's interesting, but I don't know. And all Israel fled, everyone to his own home. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up for himself the pillar that is in the king's valley, for he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. The tragic legacy of Absalom. And what's the irony of Absalom's name? Av, which means father in Hebrew, and shalom, which means peace in Hebrew. As a father, does he have anyone to carry on his name? Nope. Has he thus far been a king of peace? Or a father of peace? Nope. Kind of the tragic irony of his own name. David is going to hear, I'll just kind of paraphrase this part. David is going to hear about Absalom's death, not from an Israelite, but from a Cushite. What parallel are you seeing here? When was the last time David was informed about a king being killed in battle? Saul and Jonathan. Was it an Israelite or a foreigner who brought the news to David? It was a foreigner. Yeah. And what did David do to that foreigner? Killed him. So when Joab sends a Cushite, it's because he's done a little bit of remembering. He said, last time someone delivered this news to David about the death of Saul and his friend Jonathan, David killed him. Imagine what he's going to do when it's his son who's died. Again, the story of David is replaying again. And so I like to think of this as a death and resurrection cycle for David as king of Israel. Yahweh was the one who nurtured him and raised him and appointed him king. David was the one who undid his own kingdom, and so he died. And by replaying his story of going in, being chased out of his kingdom, living in exile, waiting on the Lord's vindication, the king that was opposing him being killed by someone other than himself, he's replayed his story and so experienced a resurrection of sorts in the narrative, okay? So I love reading scripture through the lens of death and resurrection, especially in the characters that are most important to the biblical narrative. Another kind of parallel here. When was the last time we saw a father get news of his son's death in battle? Eli. Remember Eli? His sons are the ones killed. So kind of a replaying and a parallel of David and Eli, but David will rise from the dust of death, as one commentator put it. Okay, so David is mourning for his son, and Joab rebukes him. And as I said before, this is where we kind of see Joab. Did anyone see the YouTube video that we made recently for Concordia? If you go to YouTube and you go to our channel, there have been lots of little videos we put out about kind of insights into the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Some things that we couldn't cover in here, or in the sermons that are really interesting. And the most recent one I did was on Joab. Joab has been fascinating if you've been reading the story carefully. He is the nephew of David, right? And he's a little bit impulsive, a little driven by bloodlust. Who did he kill at the beginning of 2 Samuel? Guy who was loyal to Saul, one of his generals. Starts with an A. Abner. Yeah, he killed Abner, despite David's explicit instruction not to do that, because David wanted to avoid further bloodshed. We see in Joab this guy who is amazingly faithful to David in many ways. Even as he goes into exile, Joab remains faithful to David, his king. And yet, all throughout the story of Joab and David, we saw, did Joab go behind his back to bring back Absalom? Yep, explicitly disobeyed the command of his king. Did Joab go behind his king's back and murder his son? Yep, explicitly going against the command of his king. Now Joab is rebuking the king, and David is going to demote him as we go further into 19. If you look at, as we get kind of to the stories of David coming back to the throne, there's not much fanfare, there's not really a coronation. It's just kind of David cleaning up a mess. And really, David's the guy who does his dirty work is going to really be running the show in a lot of this. And so, really quickly, because we have 8 minutes left, David is going to appoint Amasa from the tribe of Judah to now be general over his armies. Is this a good or a bad idea? I would argue it's a bad idea. Why? What has been the point of conflict between Israel and Judah that Absalom took advantage of? It seems like David shows favoritism towards Judah. Now, Judah did support David the most when he went into exile, but by David appointing a Judean man, a man of the tribe of Judah, to be general over his armies, is that going to heal any of the fractures that exist in the kingdom? Nope, it's not. David also allows them the pleasure of walking with him as he goes back to his kingdom, to his capital city. Is that a good or a bad idea? It's a bad idea, and we see they don't take favorably to this. But David is going to appoint Amasa over his army, and who's not going to like that very much? Joab. And in an event very similar to when he underhandedly killed Abner at the beginning of 2 Samuel, he is going to kill Amasa by feigning kind of a love and affection for him, and he's going to reinsert himself as the general of Israel's armies. He's going to be the one who crushes the rebellion of Sheba. But I told you I'd give you some kind of payoff for the Ziba and Mephibosheth story. So go to chapter 19, verses, let's go to 24. So I talked about the details of these characters' appearances and how they're meant to symbolize something to us. It says, and Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king. He had neither taken care of his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes from the day that the king departed until the day he came back safely. What do you think that symbolizes about Mephibosheth? Where do his loyalties lie? With David. This is why not just me, but lots of commentators take Ziba's words as untrue or kind of manipulating events to earn for himself an estate. And we see before that David had granted all of Mephibosheth's estate to Ziba, but he's going to change the sentencing sum and split it in twos. And even after he does that, what does Mephibosheth say? Does he mind? In verse 30, it says, Mephibosheth said to the king, "Oh, let him take it all, since my lord the king has come safely home." So, I don't know why I feel such a need to make this point. Mephibosheth, just like Jonathan, seems to be truly faithful to David. to Yahweh's anointed one. And I think it's an important point that the author of this narrative wants us to make note of. That this faithfulness, even in future generations, between David and his beloved friend Jonathan. Okay? I've got 4 minutes, and I'm going to use them all. Go to 20. You've got the mention of a worthless man from Sheba, or Belial. We've seen that word come up. Hannah was accused of being it. Eli's sons were Belial. We saw it earlier in 2 Samuel. I can't remember the reference right now. And how else is he described? What tribe is he from? Benjamin. Who is from Benjamin? Saul. And he blew the trumpet and said, "We have no portion in David, and we have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tents, O Israel." So this isn't civil war. This is really just kind of a secession movement. It's like if Texas decided tomorrow that we don't want to be part of the United States anymore. There was no battle fought for this to happen. It's just something Sheba colluded with other tribes of Israel. And again, I think it highlights that the fractures that existed before Absalom. Absalom just orchestrated and used those fractures to push forward his own agenda. Okay, so Absalom took advantage of fractures that already existed in the kingdom due to David's failures in a number of ways as king. So we've got the story of Amasa, the story of Joab killing Amasa. We have the story of the woman interceding and saving the entire city from Joab's wrath. I think that's probably good. We covered a lot today with chapters 14 to 20. We're getting towards the end of this narrative. Any questions? You can ask me a question from any point in 1st and 2nd Samuel for the next 2 minutes. Anything? Yeah, Brian. Oh, yeah. Okay. So you're asking, I'm going to afford the guy I don't know who it is, whoever's teaching next week to handle that question. So my offer was a little insincere. It's sometimes when you're a pastor and you're preaching and you know something is coming up in the series, you really try to make sure you don't step on any of what they have to say. Does that make sense? So I want to afford whoever's teaching next to have that opportunity. Anything else? Okay. Yes.
In God's plan, in God's universe?
Yes.
So a lie was okay.
Oh, yeah. Yep. It was. Yes. And it doesn't include Joab? Yeah, that is interesting. I don't know what to make of the mention of Uriah, but the exclusion of Joab, I think, has to be deliberate, because what is the last and final dumb and impulsive thing that Joab is going to do? He's going to oppose Solomon, who was David's appointed heir. He's going to oppose David one last time and lobby for Adonijah, David's other son, to take the throne. And so I think when these narratives were compiled together, the exclusion of Joab from that list was a pretty deliberate thing based on some of the missteps in the last part of his life. But really, really interesting. What I like so much about Joab is I don't think he fits neatly into our definitions of good and evil in terms of character as we read throughout most biblical stories. Okay. That's all I got. Have a great day.